When it comes to holiday gift giving, I want to give things people really love. Beautiful, timeless pieces they'll wear for years. That's why I'm going with Quince. From Mongolian cashmere sweaters to Italian wool coats, Quince offers premium quality at a price that works for my holiday gift-giving budget. The only problem I'm having is deciding between Quince's beautiful home goods, jewelry, accessories, bags, and clothing. There are so many options, you'll definitely find something for everyone on your list. Oh, and I should mention their adorable kids and baby clothes and their holiday PJs, which will look great in your holiday photos. Every piece is made with premium materials from ethical, trusted factories and priced far below what other luxury brands charge. Find gifts so good you'll want to keep them with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada, too. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
There are three main things that we need to do to escape the hypocrisy trap. The first one is be more consistent. Reduce our inconsistency, and behavioral science has various things that can help with that. The second point is reduce the risk of accusations. So if accusations are out of control, we need some form of defending ourselves, and we need to understand where they're coming from to anticipate them. And the third thing is change our views of hypocrisy.
That was Michael Hallsworth on Psychologists Off the Clock. We are 5 experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, author of Act for Burnout and Mac Daily Journal.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and the author of an upcoming book on developing your confidence and social skills.
From Boston, I'm Dr. Yael Schoenbrunn, faculty at Brown University and author of Work, Parent, Thrive, and an upcoming book about misunderstanding.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of Act Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hey listeners, just a super quick reminder that you can listen to the podcast ad-free by supporting us on Patreon for just $5 a month. Or you can support the podcast with a one-time donation on Buy Me a Coffee. Thank you to everyone who's already supporting us. Be sure to stay tuned to the end of the episode for our co-host's discussion of today's interview.
Welcome, everybody. Today, we're diving into something we all do but hate to admit, and that is being hypocrites. You know, that delightful moment when you lecture your kids about screen time while simultaneously checking your phone for the third time in 5 minutes, or when you tell your kids not to eat candy, but after they go to bed, you find their stash. To help us understand why we're all trapped in this very human predicament, we have Dr. Michael Hallsworth, author of The Hypocrisy Trap, How Changing What We Criticize Can Improve Our Lives. Michael has spent 2 decades applying behavioral science to real-world problems, teaching at places like University of Pennsylvania, Princeton, and Columbia. And he's taken all of that academic know-how to help design better policies and services for governments and organizations around the world. So if there's anyone who can help us understand why we're all walking contradictions and maybe, just maybe, help us do something about it, it's Michael. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Great talking with you.
So I wanted to just start with the basics and ask you to help us understand, what is hypocrisy? How can we understand what constitutes hypocrisy, this word that we all generally throw around?
The big thing I say in the book is that hypocrisy is not like a thing that exists. It is a judgment that we make about others, or about ourselves, actually. And I think the simplest way of explaining this is it's an inconsistency that we dislike. Building on that a bit, you can say that there is some kind of inconsistency between people's words and deeds, or between their words in one place and their words in another place. That's kind of the building block of hypocrisy. And then on top of that, you've got the idea that the person being inconsistent gets some kind of benefit. And in the book, I say that, the 2 main kind of benefits are social status, kind of looking good to others, or feeling good yourself. So self-image. that kind of warm sense of satisfaction of being a good person in some way. And then the final part is we think that those benefits are unjustified. So we don't think the person deserves to feel good about themselves or to look good. And that's what really annoys us. We feel that there's been a kind of unfair exchange somehow. And in the book, I explain the different kinds of reasons that drive us crazy about hypocrisy and where that sense of injustice comes from.
You offer this really interesting historical angle on hypocrisy. So can you offer us the fun fact of who were the original hypocrites?
Oh, yeah, sure. So the original hypocrites were actors. The term comes from ancient Greece, and it was basically just somebody who played a part on a stage. What then happened was, if you consider the idea of an actor, that's fine, as long as you know they're on the stage. If the concept goes broader, then you get a bit concerned, because it's like, how do I know you're acting? Are you acting in other situations where you're not telling me you're acting? And the whole concept got a bit of a turbocharge with Jesus and early Christianity. Jesus was very, very anti-hypocrites. He famously railed against the Pharisees, who took all the kind of trappings of priesthood, but didn't do the kind of hard work behind the scenes and were just kind of in it for their social image. Then over time, Christianity sort of built on this, and there was concern about also people who weren't really true believers. And obviously many kind of wars of religion and so on about different sects in Christianity. But then over time, it became more secular, and people started saying, well, it might also be about the idea that you aren't sure about your own behavior. You don't really know what you know yourself. You might be deceiving yourself. Or it might be that hypocrisy is just the contradictions that society puts on us. So broadened out from that religious, a good way of thinking about this is start on the stage, went to the church, and then broaden out into society.
Yeah. Embedded in there is this idea that hypocrisy started out as not such a bad thing, that we could tolerate this idea that people kind of showed up in one way and a different way in another situation, and that it wasn't so problematic. And then you're talking about this evolution where it started to feel more problematic. How much of the fact that hypocrisy bothers us is a social construction, and how much of it is embedded in being human and needing to trust that what people say in one place is consistent with how they're going to show up in another, or that we can trust their words to be reflected in their actions?
So I talk about in the book how calling out hypocrisy is helpful. I'm not trying to challenge that in many ways. I have these kind of different worlds of hypocrisy I talk about, and these try and illustrate what happens when criticisms of hypocrisy work or when they get out of control. And one of the good worlds is what I call the trust machine. This is where, calling out hypocrisy encourages people to be consistent with their statements. Otherwise, they get punished for it and exposed. So there is a need, you're right, to be consistent, and trust is very helpful for society to function. If we lose trust, we enter a very difficult world where you have to take loads of precautions all the time. The costs increase for everybody. What I think is underappreciated is that some kinds of inconsistency are just inevitable. I think that's particularly true in Western societies, where we have this kind of model of the consistent reasoning self who has a set of opinions and takes actions to fulfill their goals. We tend to look down on people who don't know what they think, are very inconsistent, and that's not the case in other societies as well. And that's something I end up saying at the end of the book. Maybe we need to think differently about the self. Psychologists have something of an advantage here because, Irving Goffman and many other people have talked about the idea of the performing self. This idea that the self is not an absolute essence that you conceal or reveal, but is rather something that is constructed in the performing of it. It's on the surface in a way. So the model sometimes people think about is of a chameleon rather than a deceptive creature who's trying to get an advantage. You're just trying to adapt to what kind of situation you're in. So what was really great about hypocrisy is a way in of thinking about an issue that really bothers us, but you can take it in a direction that reveals something quite profound, I think, about the way we see the self and how we desire it to be consistent all the time.
That's such an important thing. And I want to dig into that because there is something that gets lost when we get so overly focused on the importance of consistency. And it's this exact idea that you're pointing to, which is that so much of how we show up in the world is context dependent. Like how I am in a podcast interview is very different than how I am in the therapy room versus how I am as a parent versus how I am as a daughter, right? That we have to bring out different parts of ourselves. And even if we want to sort of have relatively consistent values, that there may be some inconsistencies in the particulars of how we show up. And so when we get too dogmatic about the need for consistency, that we lose something. And so that's a bit of the paradox that's at the heart of your book. And I was actually thinking about this as maybe the idea of the Aristotelian mean, that we often have this idea about virtues, like we need to be all the way on one side. But for the most part, and this is an Aristotelian philosophy, is that like we need to find the sweets. And the surprise that you write about in your book is that that is true about hypocrisy. So I wonder if you can talk about what is the right amount of hypocrisy? And if we think about this in close personal relationships even, how do we figure out how to be consistent enough that we can be trustworthy without losing our ability to be consistent enough to be able to be reliable?
That's a really great way of putting it. I hadn't thought about that analogy of the Aristotelian mean. So I'll briefly explain the problem here and the trap. So the issue is that it is helpful to call out hypocrisy sometimes. That maintains trust and so on. If that goes too far, though, you end up creating a very rigid, inhuman situation where every single inconsistency and lapse is called out. I call this the purity regime. It's a ratcheting effect where you kind of say, but do you really believe it? Do you really believe? Are you completely consistent? What about this thing you did? And as we just discussed, you have to adapt to different circumstances. You have to make trade-offs and so on. I liken this to kind of the dynamic of the Reign of Terror in the French Revolution, where there was a relentless hunt for hypocrites. In that case, the criticisms have kind of got out of control. In contrast, you can have a world in which people kind of accept there's some inconsistency, that we're all flawed people striving for something better, that we have to make these compromises. Indeed, I call that world the everyday compromises world. The danger with that world is that you become complacent. You kind of think, well, I'm basically a good person. Sure, I lapsed here and there. And it actually can license a different kind of cynicism and even cruelty, because you're like, well, you can always find a way of justifying what you've done because you're not aiming for such a high bar. And that can lead you, in fact, to the final world in which no one really cares about hypocrisy. You can just basically do what you want if you're strong enough. And that's the world of the brazen power plays, where, you don't have to care about being a hypocrite because you can just do things. What I say is that you need to kind of keep in the two positive worlds of the one where you're preserving trust while also making compromises. And the way I think we can do that is by not trying to stamp out every single instance of hypocrisy, but tolerating some. Understanding that although it's really easy to call out hypocrisy sometimes, we shouldn't do it, because if we do that all the time, we make the concept meaningless, or we enter a world in which no one can try for anything because they fear being called out. And the key thing that I offer in the book is a way of trying to make those choices, of trying to decide what kind of hypocrisy should we let go and what should we call out. And the core of it is harm. I try to show how some forms of hypocrisy end up being really harmful. And in particular, I talk about double standards as a way that, the compromises and the ability to work together in society can disintegrate if we decide there's a different rule for our group versus another group. And so the ultimate purpose of the book is to try and help people say, when should you hold off and let something go, even though it's annoying, and when should you call it out because there are bigger issues at stake?
Yeah. And that gets to this question of the hypocrisy trap, which is that when we call it out, this really paradoxical thing happens where it creates more of it. So how can we understand why and how that happened? Because that seems really important.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it was the big breakthrough for me writing this book when I realized that it's the criticism that's the key thing, and it's the criticism that can cause the problem. So when I tell people that the book's called The Hypocrisy Trap, they think the trap is we fall into the trap of being hypocritical. We fall into the trap of being inconsistent in our words and deeds. And actually, that's not my main point. Some parts of the book are about how we can be more consistent, how we can use behavioral science and psychology to be more consistent. But the core argument is about what happens when criticism of hypocrisy runs out of control. So some calling out of hypocrisy is healthy. It protects our kind of shared standards. But some letting go of hypocrisy is healthy too, because real life involves these kind of trade-offs and these imperfect steps forward. The trap happens in two main ways. So first, when we're calling out hypocrisy, we actually create more of it. And that sounds strange, but let me explain this. So if quite often when you're calling out hypocrisy, you give the impression to yourself or others that you're doing it out of principle. You're doing it to sort of preserve justice and to right a wrong in some way. But actually, some of it is because you want to feel good about yourself and look good. Because the accusation, I explain in the book, is a way of claiming status for yourself. Actually, it's like the dynamic of hypocrisy. Hypocrites often condemn others for doing the same thing that they do themselves.
There's like this hit of self-righteousness that we get when we say, you're such a hypocrite, because it makes us feel like we're looking down on the other.
Exactly. And it's like, I actually say it's a bit like revenge or schadenfreude as well, because part of the dynamic of hypocrisy is the hypocrite is claiming social status, claiming to look good, claiming to look like they are consistent with a principle. And by exposing them, you are reclaiming some of that social status, because status is relative. Someone claims it, they go up, you kind of by an equivalent reaction go down. So in the accusations, you actually try and reclaim some of that. Some of your motivation is personal benefit and feeling good about yourself, but you kind of deny that. And that is the same dynamic as being hypocritical. So the criticisms of it loop back into the concept itself. And so your attempt to stamp it out just creates more of it. The second part of the trap is if you criticize every single thing as hypocritical, it becomes meaningless. You end up on a treadmill of accusations where it's just, the concept just becomes a kind of term of abuse. It's just another insult. There's a really interesting book by Judith Shklar called Ordinary Vices. If you've ever watched the show The Good Place, at one point in season 4, Chidi produces Ordinary Vices as the kind of solution for ordering a better world. Because without wishing to digress, the point of the book is, she says there are the 7 deadly sins, sure, but there are also these kind of ordinary things that in everyday life, what she calls ordinary vices, like hypocrisy, snobbery, flattery. And her common theme is that the way of distinguishing between them is the level of cruelty involved. And so in the Good Place, they say, like, the cruelty is a principle for you want to avoid in constructing a society. So in Judith Shklar makes the point that if all you can do is criticize someone else's hypocrisy in politics, for example, then you're already in a bad position. Because all you can do is point out the inconsistency in someone else's position. You can't have an argument on the same terms as them.
So there's these kind of two issues. One is that as soon as you call somebody out as a hypocrite, you're essentially activating some hypocrisy in yourself. And the second thing that you're pointing out is the more that you use this term, the more meaningless it becomes. As I was reading your book, thinking of a third thing, and I don't know if this fits into the hypocrisy trap, but I think when you call somebody a hypocrite, you're often denigrating them for something that you feel is like a immoral way to be. But we all generally think of denigrating others as a pretty immoral thing to do. So it's almost like you're calling somebody out for being bad, but in calling them out, and it's like an act of cruelty and dismissal, you're acting cruel yourself. So it sort of adds immorality to immorality when you call out the immorality in this unkind way.
Well, I suppose people would say, what is the right response to a bad act? It could be to condemn it. The difficulty with that in terms of hypocrisy is your judgment of someone's inconsistency. And you can always make a case for someone as being inconsistent in some way. And in the book, I talk about the different tactics people use to propose or defend that someone's being inconsistent. You can say, for example, that someone's being inconsistent in one way and consistent at a different level. And that's the example I give, like Marge Simpson in the book, where she's being inconsistent in one sense because she is opposing freedom of creative expression. So she's against Itchy and Scratchy, the cartoon, but she's pro Michelangelo's David. But in another sense, if she were defending herself, she would say she's consistent because the thing that she objected to in Itchy and Scratchy, the type of creative expression was extreme violence. And the thing that she defended in terms of Michelangelo's David, in terms of creative expression, was the fact he's got no clothes on. So they are different things. Like if you could object to nudity and not object to violence, that's the equivalent of what she thinks. And we do this all the time when we're having arguments. And politicians will say, I'm not a hypocrite because this issue is very different from this one. And someone else say, no, it's not. It's the same principle at stake. And so in behavioral science, we're very interested in framing. And this is a great case of how framing and reframing can defend your reputation, or it can be used to attack you viciously under the banner of hypocrisy. And I'm really interested in what happens when the banner becomes tattered and frayed and meaningless. And I think that's a real danger.
You're so right. And it's almost like you lose the forest for the trees if you're just focused on inconsistency, because you lose like the meaning of the policy that you're arguing about. And you make such an important point that there's so much subjectivity in how we assess whether somebody is being a hypocrite versus whether we're being a hypocrite. And I want to get into that because there's the actor-observer effect. It's much easier to identify, oh, that person's being inconsistent. And for ourselves, we assess more generously.
You know how some people have that superpower of being the greatest gift givers? Well, unfortunately, I am not one of them. Fortunately, though, I discovered Aura frames, and they are the best gift for just about anyone on your list. Aura is a digital picture frame that holds thousands of photos, is incredibly easy to set up, and can be accessed by multiple people from anywhere. So if you are gift-giving challenged like me, Aura is here to the rescue. For a limited time, save on this perfect gift by visiting auraframes.com to get $35 off Aura's best-selling Carver matte frames, named #1 by Wirecutter, by using promo code POTC at checkout. That's auraframes.com, promo code POTC. This deal is exclusive to listeners and frames sell out fast, so order yours now and get it in time for the holidays. Support the show by mentioning us at checkout. Terms and conditions apply.
I love learning. It's one of my favorite activities. And if you'd asked me what I would bring to a desert island, I would say, well, masterclass. Right now, I'm geeking out with the other co-hosts about their classes on writing. My personal favorite is Dan Brown's class on writing a thriller. I've read all his books. With Masterclass, you get thousands of bite-sized lessons across 13 categories that can fit into even the busiest of schedules. You can do what I do and turn your commute or workout into a classroom. With audio mode, you can listen to masterclass lessons anytime, anywhere, just like you do with this podcast. And if you're headed on a trip, you can download classes to watch offline and make the most of your travel time. It even works if you're headed to a desert island. Masterclass always has great offers during the holidays, sometimes up to as much as 50% off. Head over to masterclass.com/POTC for the current offer. That's up to 50% off at masterclass.com/POTC. masterclass.com/POTC.
So I want to talk about that in just one second, but there is a construct that you already mentioned that is very related, which is the double standard. So the double standard seems like the most obviously hypocritical thing, different rules for me versus you, that we're remarkably good at not seeing our own inconsistency. But what's happening psychologically that lets us believe it's different when I do it, I think is an important question. So I'm thinking of people, for example, who pride themselves on being brutally honest, but then get deeply hurt when you're honest with them, or the friend who values radical authenticity until you're authentic about something that affects them. And then suddenly you're the one who's being negative. So can you talk us through, in the context of the double standards hypocrisy, what makes us so blind to these self-deceived double standards in relationships?
Great question. So you asked why this happens. And there are a few examples I give in the book, one of which is like looking at your phone,
That's a good one.
where if someone else is doing it, you think they're being rude and dismissive and it's bad for your relationship. But if you're doing it, you think you're looking up something relevant and the people will thank you for it at the end of it when you give this really interesting nugget to them. When it comes to, say, infidelity, really interesting study that shows that you rate the same action differently as more or less appropriate, depending on whether you do it or your partner's doing it. But really, that difference only occurs in these sort of ambiguous behaviors. So, one example is watching movies in a dark living room with someone. How close are you sitting? What movie are you watching? Is there anyone else there? Or another one is creating a profile on a dating website. Is it done as a joke or a dare at a party, or is it done by yourself on your own? And the interesting thing about that is that when there's ambiguity and there are questions over what someone meant to do, you have access to your intentions. Or rather, you're more likely to come up with a positive story about your intentions. You can find it easier to think of reasons why it was okay because you're the one that did it. You have greater access to your reasons and how the situation affected your decisions. It's easy to construct positive reasons about yourself. For other people, you don't have access so much. So you find it harder to think of reasons. And quite often, when something's harder to think about, we have a negative judgment about it. That's kind of cognitive effort. So yeah, partly it's the perspective of you being able to access why why the good intentions were there for you and not for other people. And that only really happens when there's ambiguity.
Yeah. And it helps us to kind of focus in that it's not that anything is susceptible to double standards, but it's really these like more ambiguous things where we give ourselves much more freedom and benefit of the doubt and other people much less when it comes to these more ambiguous things. And I think that can be helpful when we're trying to assess whether hypocrisy is really happening.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is that we don't know we're doing this. So I talk about, the idea of the bias blind spot, which may be familiar to your listeners. We think that other people may be biased, but we are not. So I give the example of study done with some recruiters in Switzerland. They were told about these kind of biases to do with hiring, like halo effect, where you have a single positive aspect and that influences the rest of how you judge them. And when they're asked, do you do this? Absolutely not. When they're asked, do your colleagues do it? Certainly. And of course, the study showed that they did it themselves. We actually have double standards about perceiving double standards.
I think that is such an important point, that we do this and we're not even aware. And it's not even that we're not aware, we're convinced we're not doing it. We see everybody else's hypocrisy. We do not see our own. And in fact, we are convinced that we are much more consistent than we appear to other people, than we actually are. And I think that is an important corrective piece of feedback. And the thing that I always think about is just knowing that you have a bias in this way doesn't undo the bias. It needs to be a practice that we need to kind of keep reminding ourselves. I too will behave in hypocritical ways, even without my awareness or without my intention. And that ongoing awareness can help to be more corrective. And we'll talk about other corrective things towards the end of our interview as well. But I actually wanted to turn to politics because it's obviously on everybody's minds right now, and talk a little bit about hypocrisy in the context of democracy. You write that hypocrisy is particularly unavoidable in democratic societies. And I wonder if you can help us understand why that is.
So the issue is that in adversarial politics, you're pushed into taking a public stance on many different issues and rewarded for making those stances strong and clear, because your opponent will kind of exploit anything that's ambiguous or any kind of admission of nuance. And yet, in a democracy, there are multiple kind of groups and sources of power that you need to get on side and try and get them to vote for you. they all want different things. But that also means that you have to present things a bit differently to each of them, emphasize different things. And that means that inconsistency can slip in between the positions you take. And then if you actually get into power, it's even harder, because if you want to get something done, you have to make trade-offs. You have to make compromises. And I talk about various examples of how this happened with Obamacare in the US. But at the same time, you have to keep saying things like, I believe in principles like the rule of law and equal treatment for all. And so you have to have the exercise of power alongside the principles. But people don't like that combination. People don't like the fact that we have to shift between power and principles, and we think both are important. Rather, what we prefer as voters is kind of in our own minds shift between two contradictory positions of, why can't you stand up for what you believe in? And why can't you just get something done?
Yeah.
And so that contradiction is in ourselves as well. But when we see it in others, we see it in politicians, we get annoyed. And that's the sort of dangerous thing as well, because then it opens the door for someone to say, no, unlike those politicians, I'm really authentic, and I will actually, I can speak to your desire for somebody who really does what they believe in.
Yeah. I want to talk about that in a moment, but I just want to sort of double click on what you're saying. And this is a quote from your book. We are inconsistent in the demands that we place on politicians, but we don't admit this. We don't even admit this to ourselves. Instead, we embrace the fantasy of a simple set of principles or adopt a cynical view that everyone's just corrupt. And to me, this point really hits hard, because we can get really cynical in how we look at politicians, but you really adjusted the frame that I now have, which is that this is kind of incumbent upon them. They need to be a bit inconsistent because they have to run on a set of principles, but then they have to enact power in a realistic set of circumstances where they need to make legitimate trade-offs with people that they're collaborating with, or there are limited financial resources and so on. And so I think it does kind of help us to be less cynical about the politicians who are being inconsistent, because we realize like we're demanding that of them.
Yeah, exactly. And part of the issue is around our demands, and part of it is how politicians present what they do. So like I mentioned, a common thing in politics is, are you being consistent or inconsistent? And I just want to say, like, deceit and deception is not a good thing in politics. And that's the kind of nuance that's really important, because if you want to say you have to be absolutely consistent, then that's just unrealistic with politics. And what I'm trying to say is there's a space in which you can, I think, connect the principles with the pragmatism if you're a good politician. And so I talk about, debates are often, I'm not a hypocrite because I am actually fulfilling the principles in this particular way. And so what it does is it takes you into a very interesting space of, what does it mean to promise universal healthcare, for example? That can be realized in many different ways. Many different countries have set up different systems of doing that. If you have an idea, a principle, then there's a gap between that principle and reality. And I think that is the essence of governing. It's not a source of criticism. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, if I were to reflect that back, I think what you're saying is like the principle is sort of like the abstract thing, and then how it gets manifested in reality can look a lot of different ways. But one could argue that this sort of abstract reality could have some fantasy permutation associated with it. But you could say, as a politician, the essence of this is still being portrayed through this policy, even if it's not the ideal vision. We're sort of bumping up against reality, but the essence of the principle remains. And so you can work around this accusation of hypocrisy, even though there might be inconsistency between the fantasy and reality, by saying that the principle is still embedded in the reality.
That's right, yeah. And I think that this is where the problem of having the word hypocrisy meaning different things is quite problematic.
Yeah.
And how, in that view, some form of hypocrisy is actually inevitable if you want to get anything done in a democracy. And rather than criticizing it as a deliberately deceptive failing. It's more like it's a product of the way democracy is set up and the product of how we think about politicians ourselves. And we're actually just giving ourselves a bit of a break if we make these inconsistent criticisms of politicians.
And that was actually going to be my next question, which is what kind of political hypocrisy should we practice tolerating?
This is why the issue is so fascinating, because there is no absolute solution here. Like, if I say that you need to tolerate some forms of compromise and inconsistency in politics, I think that's right, but then only up to a point, right? You know, we need at least some tethering to principles, I think, in democratic societies. Otherwise, you get completely lost. So you need some elements of what I call the trust machine. And I think this is where, again, the skill of being a democratic politician can come in, because you're trying to then say either that I'm still consistent with my principles, or this time we need to compromise. And this time we need to deviate and just to get something done. But then the question is, how many times do you deviate? And then at what point do you start getting into the bad worlds of like brazen power plays, where the series of compromises means that actually you end up not caring about the principle in the end, because it all became so easy. I could just do whatever I wanted if I don't have to think about principles. And so this is where the concept of hypocrisy becomes so slippery, and like one of the hardest things in the world is to get that, what you said, the Aristotelian median, to get the midpoint, to provide some kind of moderation, because no one wants to hear that. That's not a popular thing.
Right. No, we want the recipe. And the Aristotelian mean is hard to achieve with anything. And I think maybe hypocrisy is like the hardest of anything I've thought about so far. But I did an interview with Barry Schwartz, who wrote this book called Practical Wisdom, that was all about the Aristotelian mean. And it requires like this level of wisdom and centeredness and ability to kind of pivot based on context of how you manifest a virtue in a given situation. That really requires somebody who has that inner wisdom. And I think that's what we're looking for from our politicians. And it's what we're looking for in our close relationships too, is that somebody can sort of manifest a sense of consistency in a realistic way so that we can trust them, but also so that we can be flexible enough to adapt to ongoing changes in our environment and our relationships.
I think that's absolutely right. And it's something I was trying to put my finger on in the book. How do you express that? Because it's a very shape-shifting concept, but you kind of know it when you see it. And if you have somebody on the sideline shouting, you're being a hypocrite, you're being hypocritical, every point, that will never happen. And so I actually give the example for companies as well. Again, the same dynamic happens. We want things to be cheap, but also to feel good about buying them. And so sometimes companies also are trying to get to a better place, but they announce things before they get there. Now, the easiest thing in the world is to get extremely annoyed with corporate hypocrisy and portentous adverts and all this kind of thing. I do myself. But unfortunately, it can be that the company makes the announcement and they kind of talk themselves into a better place. And if when they make the announcement, your first reaction is, but you don't do that right now, and you're hypocritical, then you may never get to that better place. Does that feel good? No, it doesn't feel good. You know, the last thing I want to do is sort of say, let's let a corporate giant feel good about themselves without having earned it. But the truth is, unfortunately, you may have to let them say some of that stuff, and then 5 years later, they've achieved their goals because they made that commitment. And that is worth, I think, the price of holding off on accusations of hypocrisy.
Yeah, it's like, be careful about crying out hypocrisy because you might undermine good objectives.
Absolutely. And it's worth reiterating that the accusation of hypocrisy is really bad for companies. Like, it really hurts them. It can destroy their brands, just as it can destroy our personal brands in our everyday lives. And the first part of the book is showing those instances of how much we hate it and how much we want to destroy hypocrisy and the people who we see as hypocrites. So there is real stuff at stake here.
Yeah.
And it feels like so tempting just to go all out at any point. Like I said, it can be the accusation of hypocrisy is the one thing we can hold on to and grasp no matter what. But over time, it's creating big problems for us.
Right. I mean, you have this point in the book where you say hypocrisy is like one of the areas of common ground. Like when all else fails, we can all agree hypocrites are bad. And so it's like this really consistent word that you can use as slander in politics, for corporations, and in our personal relationships. And I think about this in the personal relationship realm. But as soon as like one partner calls the other out for being a hypocrite, like they're no longer collaborating on the relationship. They're like attack and defend. And it undermines the thing that, whatever the person is who's crying hypocrisy is trying to get, which is, a partner who is engaged in being consistent and truthful, because they're no longer collaborating together very effectively. And so you're right. It's sort of a bitter pill to swallow to kind of hold that back, but there may be better ways to address the thing that's bothering you.
And on personal relationships, what I think is happening there is somebody is saying, I think you are unjustly gaining something here. That's not what they really mean. But because we don't really understand what we mean by hypocrisy, even in the face of it, it can mean two different things of looking better than you deserve to or having double standards. That's a very basic distinction. But because we don't understand that, we use this word, people get very angry about it because there's very strong negative connotations. And we don't talk about the real issue here, about why we're perceiving this judgment that we're making. And the other thing, which I think is not thought about, is the danger that someone says in that relationship, yeah, I am. What are you going to do about it? Because then you've entered the realm of contempt and you're not playing that game anymore. And that's very possible if you keep pushing that criticism without thinking about where you're actually trying to get to with it.
Parles-tu français? Hablas español? Parli italiano? If you've used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based techniques teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world. With lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers, Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/Wondery. Spelled BABBEL.com/Wondery. Rules and restrictions may apply.
I don't know about you, but I usually love a good spreadsheet. Unfortunately, they just don't cut it anymore when it comes to managing and organizing our family finances, especially this time of year when things get a little more complicated during the holiday season. That's why I was thrilled to discover Monarch. Monarch does the heavy lifting, linking all your accounts in minutes and even sending alerts when it notices a large or unusual expense. So if you want to keep your finances under control this holiday season, you need to be using Monarch. Rated Wall Street Journal's best budgeting app of 2025, Monarch is the all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean interface on your laptop or your phone. And right now, just for our listeners, Monarch is offering 50% off your first year. Don't let financial opportunities slip through the cracks. Use code OFFTHECLOCK at monarch.com in your browser for half off your first year. That's 50% off your first year at monarch.com with code OFFTHECLOCK.
I think that's such a good point, is to sort of pause when you feel that instinct to cry hypocrisy and ask yourself, like, what's really going on? What's bothering me? Is it the double standards? Is it the inconsistency? Is it the unjust benefits? And can you sort of get to the root of it rather than sticking with this word that doesn't really get us very far? You also have a lot of really great suggestions of how we can reduce the worst forms of hypocrisy. So I wonder if you can leave us with a couple of things to be thinking about as we move through our days and our political landscape.
So I say in the book that there are three main things that we need to do to escape the hypocrisy trap. The first one is be more consistent. Reduce our inconsistency, and behavioral science has various things that can help with that. The second point is reduce the risk of accusations. So if accusations are out of control, we need some form of defending ourselves, and we need to understand where they're coming from to anticipate them. And the third thing is change our views of hypocrisy. So change the expectations of inconsistency that we have. And that's the point about thinking about different view of the self as necessarily inconsistent. And that alone is not a thing to call out. So in terms of being more consistent yourself, there are various things you can do in terms of making a commitment. Behavioral science often talks about commitment devices, where you create a cost for not following through on your principles or your goals. That cost can be looking bad to others. It can be a real monetary cost. I give an example of how, you can make yourself be fined money if you pick up your phone. That's a pretty good way of not picking up your phone. And of course, the reason I say this is one part of being a hypocrite is actually not doing, what you condemn others for, or what not fulfilling your goals. So there are actually ways we can force ourselves to be more consistent. Although an interesting wrinkle is you don't necessarily want to tell people that you're using these commitment devices because people look down on you. They prefer you just to use willpower. So we have our prejudices there. And then one other interesting idea I talk about is that of induced hypocrisy, which is a concept that's been around for a while and basically addresses cognitive dissonance. So that feeling of discomfort when there's a gap between your statements and your behavior, your beliefs and your behavior. And of course, one way of addressing that conflict is changing your beliefs. And often that's easier and saying, well, actually, I didn't care about that thing anyway. But another way of doing it is changing your behavior and becoming consistent with your principles to relieve yourself of that discomfort. And that's what induced hypocrisy does. Basically, you get somebody to commit to a principle like you shouldn't use your phone when driving. Get them to promote that in public as a principle, and then in private, confront them with the fact that they themselves have violated that principle, and then give them a way of changing. You can't do it in public because people will just use reactance and deny and defend. But in private, it appears that it can have a difference and make it. In private, it appears it can make a difference. At least create this window of opportunity for change, which you can build on in other ways. And so that's the idea of inducing hypocrisy by making people aware of that conflict, and that can lead to the opportunity for changing.
Yeah, these are such great tips. And we actually had Katie Milkman on the podcast, so we'll link to her episode in the show notes because she talks about some of these strategies. You've offered us a bunch more. And I love how you noted in your book that shaming people doesn't promote behavior change, but a little guilt and an opportunity and a set of skills to try to do better in consistency is really important.
But I should say, that's true, but we also need to make that judgment about what is worth making people feel guilty about, because guilt is a cost as well. So we don't want to do it for every little inconsistency. We want to do when it matters.
Yes. And, before we end, I just want to say that this conversation and your book really made me think differently about hypocrisy. This idea that we get so worked up about people being inconsistent may not be something to really send a lot of resources towards. In fact, it may be quite helpful to allow for some inconsistency based on context. And that doesn't mean that, as you said, that you have to give up, that people should kind of be principled and have some level of consistency. But if we can kind of shift our attitude, both in our personal relationships and really in our politics, it can help us to be less cynical and come down on inconsistencies that actually matter versus getting all caught up in the ones that are really just distractions.
Yeah, and I think one thing that came through to me while writing this book is when we get angry at inconsistency, at hypocrisy, we're actually getting at something else, although we don't realize it. It's not the inconsistency. There's some other kind of injustice or harm, some other kind of injustice or harm that's bothering us. And that's the place we should be looking, because if we just focus on the inconsistency, we actually create more harm in the end. And that's a weird thought, but after writing this, I became completely convinced it's true. And that's the great thing about writing a book. You discover something new in the writing of it. And that was really fun.
It really came through that there was some novel ideas of how to think about and approach and engage with this idea of hypocrisy. So,
well, thank you, because I wanted to write a book where it wasn't the same stuff you read in other books. And what was really interesting is I found there's a whole range of studies which I'd never heard of in this field of hypocrisy research. And uncovering those and explaining them to people was a joy.
Well, it was a joy to have you on today. Where can people find out more about you and your work, Michael?
So they can go to my website, which is michaelhallsworth.com, or there's also a website for the book, thehypocracytrap.com.
Perfect. We'll link to those in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks so much.
I'm here for the co-host post with Emily to discuss the hypocrisy trap, how changing what we criticize can improve our lives. And I just want to start with like a funny aside that I was thinking about. You know that song from Avenue Q, Everybody's a Little Bit Racist?
Oh, yeah.
As I was preparing for this interview and after, I just kept having this go through my head of everybody's a little bit of a hypocrite. Because we all kind of are. And I think that is one of the things that comes through in this interview. But I think there's a lot to talk about with hypocrisy. And certainly in our current political landscape, there's a real lot to talk about. But I'm curious, Emily, what stuck out for you?
Well, it was funny. I was so curious with the title and like, how are we going to talk in so much depth about hypocrisy? It's not something I think about all that explicitly. But as I was listening, I was realizing this is everywhere and we're all part of it at some level. And right now in the political climate is, I think, the perfect example of what you were talking about around how we undermine what we're upset about when we're calling someone a hypocrite by not allowing them to change, right? And so where I'm seeing that right now is what's going on with Marjorie Taylor Greene. And there is none of us that is supporting her like history here. It's very, it's an interesting pivot that's happening right before our eyes. And she's getting so much really intense pushback. And then I'm thinking, but do we want the people that we think are really harmful to society? Do we want them to change? And how do we become part of that?
Yeah, I mean, that really relates back to an episode that I did recently with Peter Kim on how trust works, and this idea that when we see a trust violation that we identify as an integrity violation of like, you did a bad thing because you're a bad person, that when that person apologizes or tries to change, it's sort of actually our interpretation, if we see it as an integrity violation, is like an admission of guilt and more proof that they're irredeemable. And I think that's essentially what you're saying, is that if that is how we treat any evidence of hypocrisy, any evidence of inconsistency, which is human, right? We're never going to be perfectly consistent. And if we see that person as being inconsistent because of integrity problems, then it can so easily cause us to behave in a way where we treat them as irredeemable and we disincentivize change.
Yep.
And if we are wanting somebody who's behaved badly to behave better and we're disincentivizing change, I mean, that needs to be something that we really think about, because that means then that we're a part of the problem of people behaving badly, continuing to behave badly.
Exactly. And I think it's really important to recognize what you spent a lot of time talking about, that we are all hypocrites. And part of that is the nature of being human, that it's impossible to be 100% consistent. I mean, that's being a robot. That's not being open-minded and fluid and allowing for context. So I think it's so important if we can recognize the hypocrisy within ourselves in a less judgmental way, then we can maybe be more forgiving of when we see it in other people as more of a shared human experience than a moral failing.
That's so beautifully said. And I do think that that's this recognition, exactly as you're saying, that we're all a little bit of a hypocrite. We're all hypocrites. And that when we call somebody out for their hypocrisy, to kind of be curious, in my calling you out for saying something nasty, is it feeling to you like I'm saying something nasty to you? Like, you know, in those moments where we're calling people out for inconsistencies, can we look and get curious about whether we're behaving inconsistently with our own values, with the way that we want to show up in the world? And I do think that that can be done in like a non-shaming way, just a curious way, like we're all human, and can motivate us to be careful with our calling out, but also careful with our own behavior. So I think that this conversation gives us a lot to think about and talk about, and none of it is simple or easy, but I think it's so important. So we hope that you got a lot out of this episode. And if this conversation changed how you think about hypocrisy, please let us know. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. You can now listen to our podcast ad-free by becoming a supporter on Patreon. You can link to Patreon on our website or go to patreon.com/offtheclocksite.
If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review and sharing this episode with a friend or an enemy who would enjoy it.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our fabulous newsletter on Substack. Or if you're still addicted to social media, find us on Instagram and LinkedIn.
We'd like to thank our rockstar production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
Now for the boring part. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.